Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to this third and final installment in the Guitar Tutor tutorial. Today we're going to cover all of the functionality, the features of the application that I haven't covered in the previous two episodes. Now you'll find a link to the tutorial playlist in the description below, as well as a link to version 2.92 of this application, which I'm giving away free as a part of this tutorial. Future versions of the program will be made available to my patrons and channel members, and there's links to all of that stuff. And with all of the shilling done, let's get on with the functionality. Let's deal with the rest of the tabs in the left-hand viewer that we haven't dealt with so far. Firstly, strings and frets. Now, a lot of this is really self-explanatory, so I'm only going to point out the stuff that might not be quite so intuitive. By default, Guitar Tutor loads up as a 6-string guitar tutor, but it doesn't have to be. My 4-string bass, which has 20 frets, all of this stuff is pre-configured to the instruments I own. Once I've clicked the 4-string bass button, I click Update, and now the interface reflects a 20-fret 4-string instrument. Switch back to 6-string guitar and update that. Now currently the number of strings are limited to 4, 5 and 6, so if you own a 7-string instrument, I'm sorry. If there's enough demand for it in the future, I might consider extending these presets. This program was written long before I considered ever giving it to anybody else, and so it's very much tailored to my needs. In addition to being able to configure the number of strings and the number of frets, you can also specify different tunings. So if you want drop D tuning, for instance, select D as your lowest string, click Update, and now the guitar is in drop D, and everything basically updates accordingly. The entire application is based on offsets. This is also persistent. So if I close Guitar Tutor down and relaunch it, it remembers the last set of options that we had. That goes for the number of strings as well. If I'm playing bass, I'll generally do that over multiple different sessions, and so every time I launch Guitar Tutor, I want it to remember exactly where I'm up to. Next tab along is Circle of Fifths. This is predominantly informational. Now, the reason why this circle looks a little bit strange and it's not particularly elegant is because it's built dynamically. Ordinarily, the circle of fifths is based with C at the top. And if you were to look at the circle of fifths in a textbook, you'll see the number of sharps increasing around here and the number of flats increasing around the other side. So we know, for instance, just by looking at this, that the key of D major is going to have 2 sharp notes. And if I plug in D major, we switch to keyboard mode, there are the 2 sharp notes. It's also worth mentioning at this point, actually, in one of my previous videos, I wasn't able to find an example of best fit doing anything useful. I should have thought that the key of F sharp is perfect for this, because F sharp is also G flat. If you go around the circle of fifths, you'll see that it's both 6 sharps and 6 flats. So what happens if we click the button that's currently labelled F sharp? Let's have a go. So there's a couple of points I'll make here. Firstly, Guitar Tutor is fundamentally flat preferenced. In other words, if it ever has the opportunity to make a choice between flats and sharps, it always chooses flats first. That was a purely arbitrary decision on my part. I could have gone either way. But of course, in the case of what's now G flat, we know that it can also be F sharp. G flat has 6 flats, but F sharp has 6 sharps. It's the same keys, the same fundamental frequencies, but they're simply labelled differently. And this is an example of best fit. So when we click that button and it switched to flats, that's demonstrating Guitar Tutor's kind of flat preferenced nature, but I can force it to display sharps, and now it'll represent that key as F sharp. Switch back to best fit, and Guitar Tutor will return to its preference of flats. Now then, I was talking earlier about these labels being a bit clunky because they're actually drawn dynamically. This is to enable me to represent modes. So ordinarily, the circle of fifths is all about the major key. It's very prejudiced towards keyboards, frankly. The circle of fifths is based on the fact that you're playing a piano and it looks all elegant with all of the white keys being played. But it occurred to me one day that you can actually view the circle of fifths in multiple different perspectives. So if, for instance, you're playing in the Dorian mode, now C Dorian doesn't have all the white keys. In fact, the circle of fifths has updated to tell you what key you need to be in if you want to be playing all of the white keys. D Dorian plays all of the white keys, and so the circle of fifths works. In the key of B Dorian, you have 3 sharps. I thought that was a pretty cool thing to be able to represent, and so all of the modes of the major key orient themselves so that the entirely natural notes sit at the top of the circle. This only works for major scales. I shouldn't really need to say that, but it's only the major scale that has the possibility, the potential to have all white keys. So if you switch to any other scale, then the circle effectively becomes redundant and you really shouldn't be here in the first place. Everything else in this tab is just plain text, just little bits of reminders to help me with some of the basic kind of 101 music theory. Exactly the same goes for intervals. In fact, this is entirely plain text. This whole tab, you basically never need to visit. It's completely informational. And I wrote down mnemonics of pieces of music that I'm very familiar with. If I'm trying to identify a minor second, for instance, I'll hum the theme of Jaws, and those first two notes are a minor interval apart, a minor second interval. Nothing else interesting to say about that. Let's have a look at the Metronome tab. So here's our metronome, 5 beats per bar, running at 100 BPM. Click Start. You can hear those sounds ticking. You've got 3 different waveforms of sound to choose from, and they're denoted by these 3 color bars. So for instance, if I want tone 1, tone 2, and tone 3, basically click in the zone that you want to hear the corresponding click from. So let's hear what that sounds like. And you can have any configuration of increasing complexity. Let's have a 7 beat with that kind of stuff going on. This little box at the top entitled Delay is useful for delay timings on your audio effects. So it's easiest to show you what's going on if I go down to 60 beats per minute. So this is basically saying if you set your delay time at 1 second, then obviously it's going to repeat exactly in accordance with the BPM. And then we have some sensible fractions thereof. So these are just really useful values to know. All 4 of those delay values are going to make sense. You're going to have pretty good sounding delay bounces off them. Down at the bottom of the window, we have a BPM training mode. So if we engage this, basically every time I press start, we're going to have a beginning BPM value, a target BPM value, and how quickly do we want to increment. So if I say 5 beats, 5 BPM every bar, let's get it running. I'll switch this back to something a bit more sensible, and you'll see very quickly what's going on. So we start at 80, then up to 85, up to 90, and every time it goes around, it's going to increase until it gets to the maximum. So you can basically create yourself like a 10-minute training session where the metronome starts off very slowly and very, very gradually ramps up. I find this a really useful way if I'm practicing purely to a metronome, which frankly I do very rarely these days. But if I want to do it, I'll use this training mode so that you get the thing under your fingers and then very slowly just get faster and faster. The 3 sounds that you can hear in the metronome are actually in the application installation folder. So you can overwrite these sound 1, 2, and 3 WAVs with anything you want. They need to be called that. The application is looking for files of that name, but you can basically replace them with any sound that you want. Next along, we have Notepad. This is a persistent clipboard. So whatever you type in here, shut your application down. When we reload Guitar Tutor, ABC is back. The next tab isn't quite so easy. The ARP tab only works in keyboard mode. In fact, if we switch back to guitar mode, I don't even know what happens. Yeah, it just completely shuts down. The ARP tab doesn't update properly unless we're in keyboard mode. If you are in keyboard mode, every time you change key, you're going to see a load of information change here. This is for making harmonic sense of sequences. I've dialed up an example in the background. Let's have a look at the example first, and we'll come back to Guitar Tutor in a moment. So we have a sequence preset in the ARP 2600 here. If I press a single key, I'll just play C. The notes that you're hearing here have sequential offsets. So we have zeros, we have sevens, because the ARP rounds up and down. So that's going to be a 7 semitone, that's going to be another octave. There's another 7 there. Somewhere along, there's going to be a 10. There we are. So 0, 7, and 10 are the important interval offsets that we're dealing with this sequence. So what I want to know is, which of the keys of the keyboard can I play and have that sequence be in a particular key? Well, firstly, I need to decide what key I'm starting in. So let's say I'm in C minor. So which of the keys of C minor can I play and have the entire sequence still be in the key of C minor. That's what the ARP tab tells us in Guitar Tutor. So we have our interval offsets 0, 7 and 10, and we're in the key of C minor. You have to manually look down this list. You have no idea how difficult this was to implement. Here's 0, 7, 10 in the list. What it's basically saying is that you can play any of these notes and everything will still be in key. So we've got C, F, G, B flat. So here's my little part representing C's, F's, G's and B flats. Every note that you're going to hear played by the sequencer is going to be in the key of C minor. The greater the complexity of intervals in the sequence, in other words, the number of different notes in the sequence, the fewer your options are going to be. So for instance, if we add a minor third, we're going to have 0, 3, 7, 10 now. We're at a different part of the list and we would have to abandon that B flat. B flat would no longer, one of the notes in the B flat sequence is no longer going to be in the key. The vast majority of the time, as you saw in that case with the ARP, you're going to be dealing with interval offsets. And so 0, 7 and 10 in terms of semitones are the numbers that you're looking for. If, however, you're looking at note-based offsets, that's going to be the root, the perfect fifth, and the minor 7. Well, that's going to be 1, 5, 7. And so you're basically just dealing with a different set of offsets. They're both describing exactly the same notes, simply from a different perspective. One of them's diatonic and one of them's chromatic. The last tab that we haven't covered yet is variations. Now this is dealing with the concept of borrowed chords. In order to get anything in this window, you need to click one of the chords in the chord map. So if, for instance, I click the chord of G minor 7, a ton of information appears in here telling you all of the borrowed chord variants that have some sort of relationship with G minor 7. Now, I did a video fairly recently on the concept of borrowed chords. I'll put a link to that above. Just a quick mention, when I made that video, I was only dealing with notes one different from their original chord. So this is basically extended, the concept is extended since then. But what effectively we're dealing with here is kind of sensible variations to chords that you might want to play that give you some sort of tonal interest. Dialed up a piano to help me with this next example. So here's a simple chord progression in C minor. There's my C minor, F minor, G minor, C minor. Couldn't be any simpler. However, I can borrow chords. So let's deal with a couple of examples and we'll keep things nice and simple with triads. So here's G minor, and Guitar Tutor is suggesting that G major is a good substitution for that chord. So if I play a C minor and an F minor and then a G major, back to the C minor again, yeah, it sounds good. I'm borrowing a chord from the relative major scale. But you can get a little bit more exotic. Let's select the F minor now so that we're seeing all of the examples of all of the different F minor borrowed chords that we can play. And we'll do something a bit fruitier. I'm going to borrow one of the chords from the harmonic minor scale. Now, harmonic minor and C minor do have a fairly close harmonic relationship, and it is possible to borrow chords from this kind of cross-pollinating idea. So I'm going to borrow the E augmented chord from one of the modes of the harmonic minor scale. So here's an example of that E augmented in use. I'll start with an F minor, E augmented, E flat major, D diminished, C minor. All of those chords, all of the other chords were in the key. The only different thing was the E augmented, and I basically did like a walking bass line. So I'm looking for sensible ways to use this stuff, but this list of borrowed chords gives me lots of really interesting things to think about. I'm not a musical savant. I'm not one of these people who can hear a 7-note chord and break it down into all of its individual components. I don't have a truly intrinsic understanding of what I'm hearing in real time. Now, if you can jam along to kind of Charlie Parker or Giant Steps, good luck to you, you know, my hat's off. But that's not the case with me. I need a little bit of technical assistance sometime to throw interesting ideas at me that I might not think of at the time when I'm in the course of writing music. Ordinarily in the key of C minor, this E natural has no place in the key, and yet simply by seeing this list of potential borrowed chords and thinking about the possibility of playing the E augmented, it gives me the idea to do the walking bass line. And it just sounds great. So there are no rules here. Don't consider yourself bound to this list. It's just a set of suggestions, kind of interesting things to try. If you take one of the borrowed chords that has two substitutions, like this G flat diminished, then you're really not very close to the chord that you started with in the first place, and you just need to use a little bit of common sense about this stuff. Finally today, let's have a quick look in the options menu, see what we haven't dealt with here. Show complex scales. At the moment, we just get three simple 7-note scales. Strictly speaking, the major scale is the only diatonic scale in existence, but actually most people refer to any 7-note scale as diatonic. Harmonic minor and melodic minor are the most common, but certainly by no means the only 7-note scales possible. I've included 3 others in Guitar Tutor, Hungarian Gypsy down to Enigmatic, and they become increasingly complex. And in this rarefied territory, you are going to start seeing strange notes like double flats. I've switched back to guitar mode here because as we head out of the 7-note territory into where we've got the pentatonic scale here, 5 notes, you get some stuff in this box describing what the scale mode means. That text doesn't appear in keyboard mode, it's blanked, because really it's talking about fret offsets. So here's the pentatonic scale. One step below that we have the minor blues scale, which is effectively the pentatonic switched into a minor mode and then with a flatted fifth being added. So here's the pentatonic minor with an added flatted fifth. If I jump back to the pentatonic scale, actually, you can see all of the different modes. So in this context, I've actually put pentatonic minor up as the first mode, but you can have pentatonic major as well. Then we've got the major blues scale. Chord map goes completely out the window when you're talking with the blues scale. It has a completely different set of rules all to itself. And then whole tone and diminished, and once again, a completely different set of rules apply to all of those. So much less support for these features. You don't get things like borrowed chords or chord maps with any of the exotic scales. And the vast majority of the time, I keep the application in simple mode and just deal with the primary scales, and that does me fine. Now you can engage this scrollable feature, which makes Guitar Tutor shrinkable. It doesn't scale very well. I never got around to drawing it as a proper scaled application, but you can make it very small and then scroll to the bit of user interface that you need if you want to do that. Ordinarily, I'm not interested in scroll bars because it's always exactly the size that I want it to be. And then the options below are simply colorization options. So if I always want to see all of the sixths in the scale, I can engage colorized sixths and see those. Speaking of which, I usually have colorized sevenths. And that's how I use Guitar Tutor as my standard kind of operation. And we're pretty much done. Hope you enjoyed the series, and I hope you enjoy using Guitar Tutor. I'll see you again. Thanks very much.